By the time the country understood what had been happening on the Yorkshire moors, the landscape had already become a witness. Not the kind that speaks in courtrooms or provides testimony under oath, but the kind that holds everything in silence, preserving what others tried desperately to hide. The moors stretch across northern England like an ancient document written in heather and peat. In wind and stone, they are vast in a way that defies easy comprehension, not through dramatic elevation or jagged peaks, but through their relentless continuation, their refusal to break into anything smaller or more manageable. Mile after mile, the land rolls forward in waves of brown and purple, punctuated by outcroppings of dark rock that seem to have pushed through the earth like old bones surfacing. This is not wilderness in the way cities imagine wilderness. It is not the untamed forest of fairy tales or the threatening jungle of colonial imagination. The Yorkshire moors are something else entirely, something more unsettling, precisely because they feel so familiar, so woven into the fabric of English identity. They appear in literature and painting, in weekend plans and family photographs. They are where people go to breathe, to walk, to escape the compression of urban life. The air there moves differently, unobstructed by buildings or trees, carrying scents of earth and grass across distances that make the horizon seem both close and impossibly far. On certain days, when low clouds settle across the landscape, the moors become a place where sky and ground lose their distinction, where a person walking alone might feel they have stepped outside of ordinary geography into something older and less defined. But for all their beauty, for all the romantic associations they carry in the national imagination, the moors are also profoundly isolating. Stand in the middle of that expanse and turn slowly in a circle, and you might see nothing human for miles. No buildings, no roads, no signs of the 21st century or even the 20th. Just land, rolling away in every direction, indifferent to your presence, indifferent to everything. That indifference, which seems so peaceful when you visit for an afternoon, becomes something else when you understand what happened there. When the story broke, when the pattern finally became visible, the moors themselves seemed to change in the public consciousness. What had been a symbol of natural England, of continuity with the past, of honest landscape unmarred by development, became instead a symbol of concealment. The very qualities that made the moors beautiful, the openness and the isolation, the vastness and the silence, these were the same qualities that had allowed horror to unfold undetected. This was not a dark alley in a dangerous neighborhood. This was not an abandoned warehouse in a declining industrial zone. This was a place families visited, where couples walked hand in hand, where photographers came to capture the particular quality of northern light. The crimes that took place on the Yorkshire moors were not hidden in shadow. They were hidden in plain sight, in a landscape so familiar that no one thought to look at it differently. And that is what makes this story so deeply disturbing. Not just what happened, but where it happened, and how long it continued before anyone understood. Evil, when it finally revealed itself, was not wearing the costume anyone expected. It had not announced itself with obvious signs or dramatic warnings. It had simply been there, operating within the normal flow of life, using the landscape's own characteristics as a kind of camouflage. The moors had not created what happened. They were not complicit in any intentional sense, but they had been used, their isolation exploited, their silence mistaken for safety. By the time investigators began to understand the scope of what had occurred, the landscape had already absorbed years of secrets. The peat had preserved what it should not have had to preserve. The wind had carried away sounds no one should have had to make, and the vast, rolling emptiness had provided exactly what the perpetrators needed, a place where horrible things could happen without immediate interruption, without witnesses, without the ordinary mechanisms of society functioning as they should. When Britain finally confronted what had been happening on the moors, the shock was not just about the crimes themselves. It was about the realization that horror does not always look like horror from the outside. It was about understanding that the places we trust, the landscapes we romanticize, the open spaces we think of as inherently good, can be used for purposes that violate everything we believe about safety and society. The Yorkshire moors are still there, of course. They have not changed. The heather still blooms in late summer, turning the hills purple. The wind still moves across the open ground with nothing to stop it. Families still visit, walkers still follow the established paths, photographers still capture the interplay of light and cloud. But underneath that continuity, underneath the appearance of timeless natural beauty, there is now another layer of meaning, a knowledge that cannot be unknown. The landscape became a witness not by choice but by circumstance, and what it witnessed changed how a nation understood the relationship between place and safety, between familiarity and danger, between what we see and what we allow ourselves to recognize. Before everything changed, before the Yorkshire moors became synonymous with one of Britain's most disturbing criminal cases, they were simply part of the country's landscape, unremarkable in their remarkability. People used them the way people use any natural space that sits near population centers, as a resource for recreation, for transit, for the simple human need to be somewhere other than streets and buildings. On weekends, cars would pull into small gravel parking areas, and families would emerge with walking sticks and thermoses, dressed in the practical clothing of British outdoor enthusiasts, ready for a few hours of fresh air and moderate exercise. The paths across the moors were well established, worn smooth by decades of feet, following the same routes from one landmark to another. There were favourite spots, viewpoints where the land fell away dramatically enough to provide a sense of perspective, places where you could see for miles and feel briefly connected to something larger than your individual life. Couples would walk these paths hand in hand, not speaking much, letting the landscape do the work of creating peace between them. Solo walkers, often older people whose children had grown and moved away, would make regular circuits, achieving a kind of meditation through repetition, through the familiar rhythm of walking the same ground week after week. The moors were also practical, a place to cut through when travelling between towns, a shortcut that saved time if you knew the roads well. Local people had their preferred routes, unofficial knowledge passed down through families about which lanes were passable in different seasons, where you could park without getting stuck, which pubs sat at convenient distances for a midpoint rest. There was nothing exotic about any of this. It was simply how people lived with the landscape around them, incorporating it into the practical and recreational aspects of ordinary life. Tourists came too, of course, especially during summer months when the weather was most cooperative. They came with guidebooks and cameras, looking for the England they had read about or seen in films, the England of moors and mystery, of Bronte novels and period dramas. They found it satisfying, this landscape that matched their expectations, that seemed to confirm certain ideas about English character and history. They would take photographs of themselves standing against vast backdrops of earth and sky, smiling with the slightly forced enthusiasm of people determined to enjoy their vacation. Then they would return to their hotels or bed and breakfasts, pleased to have checked the moors off their list of things to experience. For people who lived nearby, the moors were even more mundane, just part of the scenery you passed on your way to work or school, part of what you saw when you looked out certain windows. Children grew up with the moors as a constant presence, the place you could see from your bedroom, the place you went on school trips to learn about ecology or geography or local history. It was background, context, the setting for life rather than life itself. Nothing about the moors suggested danger in any specific or immediate way. Yes, people understood that getting lost there could be serious, that the weather could turn harsh quickly, that you needed to respect the landscape's scale and your own limitations. But these were the ordinary cautions of rural life, the common sense that people absorbed without thinking too much about it. You wore proper shoes, you told someone where you were going, you carried water and perhaps a map. You did not wander off established paths unless you knew what you were doing. You watched the sky and turned back if conditions deteriorated. These were not dramatic precautions. They were simply what sensible people did. The relationship between the British public and their moorland was one of comfortable familiarity. The moors represented a certain kind of Englishness, rugged but not threatening, beautiful but not ostentatious, ancient but still accessible. They appeared in poetry and prose as symbols of endurance, of connection to the past, of a landscape that had witnessed centuries of human activity without being fundamentally changed by it. People felt ownership over the moors in the way citizens feel ownership over public spaces, a collective sense that this place belonged to everyone, and therefore to no one in particular. It was common ground in the most literal sense, open and available, requiring no special permission or privilege to access. You simply went there when you wanted to, parked your car or got off the bus, and walked into that vast openness with the confidence that comes from long familiarity. Nothing about the moors suggested they could become the setting for something that would shake national confidence. Nothing in their appearance or their history indicated they would become a byword for failure, for the ways in which ordinary life can conceal extraordinary horror. The people who would eventually stand at the center of this story were not immediately recognizable as threats. They did not wear masks or lurk in shadows. They were not strangers who appeared suddenly from elsewhere. They were part of the communities they lived in, visible and ordinary, the kind of people you might pass on the street without a second glance. One was employed, held a job that required showing up reliably and interacting with others in mundane professional contexts. The other managed a household, navigated the social expectations of their environment, maintained appearances that suggested nothing unusual was occurring. Together they formed a unit that from the outside looked unremarkable, perhaps even boring, the kind of couple that exists in every town and city, living their lives in ways that seem to require no particular attention or concern. They had neighbors who would later struggle to articulate what they had noticed, because what they had noticed amounted to almost nothing. There were no loud arguments that echoed through walls, no obvious signs of disturbance that would have triggered alarm. There were no complaints about suspicious behavior, no calls to authorities about concerning activities. Life around them proceeded normally because they had learned how to blend into normal life, how to occupy space without drawing scrutiny. This ability to seem ordinary is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their story. We want to believe that danger announces itself, that people capable of terrible things carry some visible mark that allows us to identify and avoid them. We want to think that our instincts would warn us, that we would feel some intuitive sense of wrongness in their presence. But the reality documented in this case is that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply exists, operating within the same social structures everyone else uses, following enough of the rules to avoid immediate detection. They attended to the small performances of normalcy that make social life function. They were polite when politeness was expected. They were quiet when noise would have attracted attention. They maintained the kind of low profile that in retrospect seems calculated, but at the time simply seemed like nothing worth noticing. And because nothing about them triggered immediate alarm because they fit within the expected range of ordinary human behavior, they were able to continue operating for far longer than anyone would later believe possible. The architecture of their deception was not elaborate. They did not construct complex false identities or maintain sophisticated cover stories. They simply lived their lives in ways that did not invite questions. And in the absence of questions, No one looked closer. This is the uncomfortable truth that the case would eventually force the country to confront. The systems designed to protect people, to identify threats and intervene before harm occurs, those systems rely on detection. They rely on someone noticing something wrong and raising an alarm. But what happens when nothing appears wrong? What happens when danger wears the face of the mundane? The answer, demonstrated clearly in this case, is that danger can persist for years, can cause damage that accumulates steadily, can operate in plain view without being seen for what it is. The perpetrators understood something fundamental about how society works. They understood that most people are not looking for threats in their everyday environments. Most people assume that the ordinary flow of life is benign, that their neighbors are who they appear to be, that the familiar landscape around them is safe because it has always been safe. This assumption is not naive, it is necessary. Life would be unbearable if we moved through it in constant suspicion, questioning everyone, doubting everything. We have to trust, to some degree, that the world around us is what it appears to be. And that trust, that necessary trust, is what allows certain kinds of deception to flourish. The first disappearances were treated as isolated incidents, separate tragedies without connection to one another. When a child failed to come home, when parents reported a son or daughter missing, the initial response followed established procedures. Local police were notified, searches were organized, appeals were made for information. But each case was handled as its own discrete event, investigated by different officers in different jurisdictions, documented in separate files that were never placed side by side for comparison. This fragmentation was not the result of negligence or incompetence. It was simply how the system functioned at the time. Police departments operated with significant independence, communicating with each other only when specific circumstances required it. There was no central database where missing persons reports could be aggregated and analyzed for patterns. There was no mechanism for stepping back from individual cases to look at the broader picture. Each disappearance was examined on its own terms, and on its own terms, each one could be explained away as unfortunate, but not necessarily suspicious. Children went missing for many reasons that had nothing to do with criminal activity. They ran away from difficult home situations. They had accidents in places where their bodies might not be immediately found. They fell in with bad crowds and ended up in cities far from where they started. These explanations were not inventions. They were based on real patterns, on things that actually happened with some frequency. So when a child disappeared and no immediate evidence of foul play presented itself, investigators would explore these more common possibilities first. They would interview family members, looking for signs of domestic trouble that might have motivated a runaway. They would search nearby areas, checking rivers and woods and abandoned buildings for signs of accident. They would circulate descriptions, hoping someone would recognize the missing child in a neighboring town. These were reasonable steps, appropriate responses to the information available, but they were also steps that took time, and while they were being followed, while investigators were working through the logical possibilities, other explanations remained unexplored. The geographic spread of the disappearances also worked against early detection of a pattern. The victims came from different towns, different neighborhoods, different social circumstances. There was no obvious common thread connecting them, no single school they all attended or community center they all visited. They were simply children living their lives in the normal way until suddenly they were not. Parents in one town had no way of knowing about similar disappearances in towns 20 or 30 miles away. Local newspapers reported on local tragedies, but there was no regional synthesis, no journalist or editor who stepped back to notice that something unusual was occurring across a wider area. Each community dealt with its own loss, experienced its own grief and confusion, without understanding that their tragedy was part of something larger. This isolation of information meant that patterns which might have been visible from a broader perspective remained hidden. What looked like random misfortune when viewed case by case began to look very different when the cases were finally assembled together. But that assembly did not happen quickly. It happened slowly, over months and years, as individual investigators began to notice similarities, began to wonder if separate cases might actually be connected. The initial response from communities was characterized by sympathy rather than alarm. When a child went missing, neighbors rallied around the affected family. They organized search parties, distributed flyers, kept watch for any sign that might lead to resolution. This was the social fabric functioning as it should, people supporting each other through crisis. But this very solidarity also had the effect of containing the response, of keeping it local and personal rather than expanding it into something more systematic. The focus remained on finding each specific child, on bringing them home, on comforting the family that was suffering. These were humane and appropriate responses, but they were not investigative responses. They were not oriented toward identifying perpetrators or understanding mechanisms. They were oriented toward hope, toward the possibility that despite the passage of time, despite the lack of evidence, somehow the child would return safely. This hope was not foolish. It sustained families through unbearable circumstances, but it also, inadvertently, delayed the shift from treating disappearances as unfortunate events to treating them as crimes that required urgent, coordinated investigation. Authorities faced criticism later for not connecting the cases sooner, for not recognizing earlier that something systematic was occurring. That criticism was not entirely fair, though it was not entirely unfair either. With the benefit of hindsight, with all the information laid out chronologically, the pattern seems obvious, but hindsight is a luxury that investigators working in real time do not have. They see cases as they emerge, one after another, embedded in a constant flow of other work, other demands on their attention and resources. They make decisions based on the information available at the moment, which is always incomplete, always subject to revision as new facts emerge. The mistake, if it can be called that, was not in how individual cases were handled. It was in the absence of systems that would have allowed patterns to become visible earlier. It was structural rather than personal, a failure of coordination and communication rather than a failure of effort or intelligence. Each case was handled alone. That was the mistake. Not because the officers involved were incompetent or uncaring, but because the infrastructure did not exist to do anything else. The Yorkshire moors played a role in this fragmentation that would only become clear much later. The landscape itself created boundaries, both practical and psychological. Towns on opposite sides of the moors might be only 15 miles apart in straight-line distance, but to reach one from the other required driving around the edges or taking narrow roads that cut through in specific places. This geographic separation reinforced a sense of separateness. Communities developed their own identities, their own internal focus, their own ways of understanding themselves as distinct from their neighbors. The moors were not a barrier in any absolute sense, but they were a presence that shaped how people thought about space and proximity. An event occurring on the far side of the moors felt more distant than it actually was, less relevant to daily life, easier to file away as someone else's concern. This psychological distance, created and reinforced by the landscape, contributed to the difficulty of seeing connections. It made it easier for cases to remain isolated in people's minds, categorized by location rather than by characteristics that might have suggested a common cause. The landscape also provided practical advantages to anyone wishing to avoid detection. The moors are vast, and not all of that vastness is regularly visited. There are popular paths where you will encounter other walkers on any decent weather day, but there are also stretches of ground where you might walk for hours without seeing another person. There are areas too rough or too remote to attract casual visitors, places you would only go if you had specific reason to be there. The terrain itself offers concealment, not through forest cover, but through its sheer scale and the rolling nature of the land. Someone moving across the moors is visible from certain angles and invisible from others. A person standing on one rise cannot necessarily see into the valleys or hollows that lie between their position and the next rise. This natural topography creates blind spots, places where activities can occur without being observed from nearby vantage points. For anyone who knew the landscape well, who understood its rhythms and its empty spaces, the moors offered opportunities that would not exist in more densely populated environments. You could reach isolated locations without being noticed. You could work undisturbed for hours. You could exploit the assumption that open space equals safe space, that visibility equals security. The peat itself became part of the mechanism of concealment. Peat forms over centuries, layer upon layer of partially decomposed plant matter, accumulating in waterlogged conditions. It is dark and dense, and it has unusual preservative properties. Things buried in peat do not decompose at the rate they would in ordinary soil. The acidic, oxygen-poor environment prevents normal bacterial action, which means organic material can survive intact for periods that would surprise anyone unfamiliar with the chemistry involved. This was not information the perpetrators necessarily understood in technical terms, but they understood it practically. They understood that the moors would hold secrets better than other landscapes might. They understood that the combination of isolation, difficult terrain, and the physical properties of peat created conditions favorable to what they needed to do. The landscape did not create the crimes. It would be absurd to suggest otherwise. But the landscape provided the conditions that allowed the crimes to continue undetected for as long as they did. The moors were used, exploited, their characteristics turned to purposes they were never meant to serve. They became, without consent or agency, accomplices to horror. When investigators finally began to understand that the disappearances were connected, when the pattern became undeniable, the response shifted dramatically. What had been handled as separate local tragedies became a coordinated investigation spanning multiple jurisdictions. Resources that had been scattered were suddenly concentrated. Officers who had been working their own cases began sharing information, looking for commonalities, building a composite picture of what had been happening. This shift brought immediate benefits. Connections that had been invisible became obvious. Details from one case illuminated details from another. Witnesses who had seen things they did not understand at the time were re-interviewed with new questions based on knowledge from other cases. The investigation accelerated, moving from reactive to proactive, from responding to individual incidents to pursuing a theory about what was actually occurring. But this acceleration also brought its own problems. The scope of what had been happening became clear, and that scope was overwhelming. The geographic range, the time span, the number of victims, all of it was larger than anyone had imagined. The investigation that was supposed to provide answers also revealed how much had been missed, how long the crimes had continued, how many opportunities for intervention had passed unrecognized. The press coverage began slowly and then exploded. Initial reports treated the connected cases as important regional news, the kind of story that would interest readers in the north but might not make national headlines. But as more information emerged, as the scale became clear, the story moved from regional to national to international. Newspapers competed for details, for exclusive interviews, for any angle that would distinguish their coverage from everyone else's. Television news devoted extensive time to the story, bringing it into living rooms across the country, making it impossible to ignore. The effect was a kind of national shock, a collective realization that something terrible had been happening without anyone understanding it. The initial response was disbelief. People read the headlines and thought there must be some mistake, some exaggeration, because what was being described seemed impossible. How could this have happened? How could it have continued for so long? Where were the authorities, the systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing? These questions had no satisfactory answers, which only deepened the sense of shock and betrayal. The transformation of public consciousness happened rapidly. Within weeks, the Yorkshire moors went from being a beloved landscape to being a name spoken with horror. Parents across the country looked at their own children with new anxiety, suddenly aware of vulnerabilities they had not fully considered before. The sense of safety that had seemed natural, almost birthright, revealed itself as more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. If this could happen on the Yorkshire moors in ordinary towns to ordinary families, then it could happen anywhere. The specifics of the case became less important than what the case represented, which was the failure of everything people had believed about how society protects its most vulnerable members. The crimes themselves were horrifying, but the fact that they had gone undetected for so long was perhaps even more disturbing. It suggested that the mechanisms everyone relied on, the police and the social services and the ordinary watchfulness of communities, all of it could fail without anyone realizing failure was occurring. This was not the kind of threat people knew how to guard against. It was not foreign or obviously dangerous. It was domestic, familiar, woven into the ordinary fabric of life. The moors themselves became a subject of intense focus. Journalists visited and filed reports describing the landscape, trying to help readers understand the geography that had played such a role in the story. Photographers captured images of the rolling heather and the empty horizon, pictures that appeared in newspapers under headlines about death and concealment. The visual contrast was jarring, the beauty of the landscape set against the horror of what it had hidden. Some reporters tried to find something ominous in the moors, describing them in language that suggested they had always been threatening, always been the kind of place where bad things happen. But this revisionism was unconvincing to anyone who actually knew the landscape. The moors had not changed. What had changed was the knowledge of what they had been used for. The land itself remained exactly what it had always been, vast and open and indifferent. It was human understanding that had shifted, human perception that now saw menace where before there had been only beauty or neutrality. This shift was not really about the landscape. It was about trust and safety and the realization that neither can be taken for granted. Public vigils were held, first in the communities directly affected, and then more broadly. People gathered in town squares and churches, lighting candles, sharing grief, trying to process collectively what felt impossible to process individually. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They honored the victims, acknowledged the suffering of families, expressed solidarity across communities. But they also served as a kind of ritual cleansing, an attempt to reclaim moral ground that felt like it had been lost. The vigils said, "This is not who we are. This does not represent us. We are better than what happened here." Whether that was true or not remained an open question. The crimes had happened within society, not outside it. They had been committed by people who were part of communities, who had been raised and educated and employed within the same structures everyone else navigated. Trying to distance the crimes from society, to treat them as aberrations completely separate from ordinary life, was understandable but not entirely honest. Something had failed. Not just individual police officers or social workers, but something more fundamental. The systems designed to keep children safe had proven inadequate. The assumption that bad things would be noticed and stopped before they went too far had proven false. And these were failures that society as a whole had to grapple with, not just the specific individuals or institutions most directly involved. The debate that erupted in the aftermath was characterized more by emotion than by clear analysis. Everyone had opinions about what should have been done differently, what changes needed to be made, who should be held accountable. Politicians gave speeches calling for reforms, promising that nothing like this would ever happen again. Experts were consulted, committees were formed, reports were commissioned. All of this activity was genuine in its intent, driven by sincere desire to prevent future tragedies. But it was also reactive, shaped by the intensity of public feeling rather than by careful consideration of what had actually gone wrong and why. The pressure to do something, anything, was enormous. But pressure is not the same as clarity, and action is not the same as effectiveness. Many of the proposed solutions addressed symptoms rather than causes, focused on visible changes that would reassure the public rather than on deeper structural problems that were harder to explain and harder to fix. Some changes were implemented quickly. New protocols for sharing information between police departments, new requirements for tracking missing persons cases, new training for officers on recognizing patterns. These were not bad changes. They addressed real problems that had contributed to the delayed detection of the crimes. But they were also limited changes, improvements to existing systems rather than fundamental rethinking of how society approaches child safety. The question of how this had been possible, how the crimes had continued undetected for years, did not have a simple answer. There was no single point of failure that explained everything, no one decision or oversight that, if corrected, would have prevented what happened. Instead, there was a complex combination of factors, each relatively small, but together creating conditions where tragedy became possible. The geographic isolation of the moors played a role. The fragmentation of police jurisdictions played a role. The fact that the perpetrators presented as ordinary and unremarkable played a role. The reluctance of communities to believe that horror could be happening in their midst played a role. The tendency to explain disappearances through more common and less disturbing possibilities played a role. None of these factors alone would have been sufficient, but together they created a system where detection was difficult and delay was almost inevitable. Understanding this complexity was important, but it was also unsatisfying. People wanted someone to blame, something concrete to point to and say, "That was the problem, we have fixed it, it will not happen again." But honest analysis could not provide that kind of reassurance. Honest analysis had to acknowledge that what happened was the result of many small failures rather than one large one, and that preventing similar tragedies in the future would require sustained attention to multiple systems and practices, not just dramatic reforms in one area. The country did not just lose innocence through this case. Many nations and communities have faced horrifying crimes that shattered comfortable assumptions about safety and normalcy. What made this case particularly damaging to British self-conception was not just the horror of what happened, but the setting in which it happened. The Yorkshire moors were supposed to represent something essential about England, something enduring and good, something that connected the present to a deeper past. They were part of the national myth, the landscape that appeared in literature and art as a symbol of authenticity and continuity. When that landscape became associated with sustained criminal horror, when it became clear that the very qualities that made the moors symbolically important had also made them practically useful for concealment, something shifted in how the nation understood itself. It was not just that bad things had happened, it was that they had happened in a place that was supposed to mean something better, and they had continued happening because systems that were supposed to work had failed in fundamental ways. The loss was not of innocence exactly, because Britain was not innocent about crime or violence. The loss was of certainty, of the confidence that society's protective mechanisms were fundamentally sound, that when they failed it was through exceptional circumstances rather than systemic inadequacy. The families of the victims faced a particular kind of torment that public understanding could not fully encompass. They had lost children in the most terrible way imaginable, but they had also lost years of not knowing, years of hoping that somehow their child might still be alive, might still come home. When the truth finally emerged, when they understood what had actually happened, the grief was mixed with other feelings that were harder to name. Relief that the uncertainty was over. Anger at the delay in discovering the truth. Guilt about time lost, about not having known sooner. These feelings did not follow a neat progression. They coexisted, creating an emotional complexity that defied easy description. The families became public figures whether they wanted to be or not. Their grief was examined, analyzed, used as a focal point for broader social conversations about protection and failure. Some of them became advocates, working to change systems and prevent similar tragedies. Others withdrew, needing privacy to process what had happened without the pressure of public attention. Both responses were valid. Both were attempts to survive something that should never have happened. But the public often struggled to understand the withdrawal, interpreting it sometimes as lack of care rather than as self-protection. The families owed nothing to public curiosity, but the public sometimes acted as if it were owed explanation, access, emotional display. This dynamic added another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation. The landscape remained, of course, physically unchanged by everything that had occurred. The heather continued its seasonal cycles, blooming purple in late summer, turning brown in winter. The wind moved across the open ground exactly as it always had, following patterns determined by pressure systems and topography rather than by human events. Rain fell, streams formed, the peat absorbed water and continued its slow accumulation. From a geological perspective, from the perspective of deep time, what had happened on the moors was barely a moment. A brief human drama played out against a backdrop of processes that operated on scales of centuries and millennia. But for the people who lived with the knowledge of what had occurred there, the landscape could never be quite the same. They could not look at the moors without remembering. They could not walk those paths without thinking about what the ground had witnessed, what it still held. Some people avoided the moors entirely after the truth emerged, unable to separate the place from the events. Others continued visiting, perhaps trying to reclaim the landscape, to reassert their right to experience it as something other than a crime scene. There was no right way to relate to the moors in the aftermath. There was only the fact that the relationship had changed, had been forced to accommodate knowledge that could not be unknown. The question of whether something like this could happen again remains uncomfortable and unresolved. The systems that failed have been improved in specific ways. Information sharing between police departments is better now than it was then. Missing persons cases receive more coordinated attention. There is greater awareness of patterns and warning signs, but systems are only as good as the people operating them, and people are fallible. They miss things, make mistakes, fail to see patterns that seem obvious in retrospect. No amount of protocol can eliminate human error or guarantee that connections will be made when they need to be made. And beyond the question of systems and procedures lies a deeper question about the nature of safety itself. Society cannot protect everyone from everything. Some level of risk is inherent in human life, and while that risk can be managed and minimized, it cannot be eliminated entirely. This is an uncomfortable truth that conflicts with the desire to believe that proper precautions and vigilant institutions can prevent tragedies. The reality is more complex and less reassuring. Most of the time, most children are safe, and most communities function without experiencing this kind of horror. But most is not all, and the exceptions, when they occur, reveal how fragile the protections actually are. The legacy of what happened on the Yorkshire moors continues to shape policy and practice in ways both obvious and subtle. Training programs for police officers now include material on these specific crimes as a case study in the importance of information sharing and pattern recognition. Social workers learn about the case as an example of how predators can operate within communities without detection. The general public retains a cultural memory of the case, a reference point for discussing child safety and systemic failure. But memory fades and distorts over time. New generations come to adulthood without direct experience of the shock that accompanied the original revelation. For them, if they know about the case at all, it is history rather than lived experience, something that happened in the past rather than something that disrupted their present. This is natural and probably necessary. Society cannot maintain indefinitely the heightened awareness and concern that follows major tragedies. Life moves forward, attention shifts to other issues, the emotional intensity fades, but something is also lost in that fading, some urgency about prevention, some understanding of how failures occur and why they matter. The Yorkshire moors are still there, exactly where they have always been, exactly what they have always been. People visit them now much as they did before, though perhaps in slightly smaller numbers, with slightly more awareness of the landscape's darker associations. On a clear day, standing on one of the high points, with the land rolling away in all directions, you can still experience the sense of space and freedom that has always drawn people to such places. The beauty is real as it ever was, the wind and the light and the colours shifting with the seasons. All of this continues regardless of human events, but layered over that beauty, impossible to completely separate from it, is the knowledge of what happened here, of what the land witnessed and held and eventually revealed. The moors did not ask to become part of this story. They were simply there, available, and were used for purposes that had nothing to do with their essential nature. They are still there now, quiet and open and unchanged, and that is precisely why this story still matters. Because the places we trust, the landscapes we love, the environments we think of as safe, they do not protect us through their own properties. They are just places. Protection, when it exists, comes from other sources, from human systems and human attention and human choice. Those can fail. They have failed. They may fail again. The moors remember this, in their own way, holding in their peat and stone a record of failure that no amount of beauty can erase. What we choose to do with that memory, how we let it shape our understanding of safety and society and the responsibilities we owe to one another, that remains an open question, one that each generation must answer for itself. The investigators who finally pieced together the full scope of what had occurred on the Yorkshire moors were changed by the experience in ways that would follow them for the rest of their careers. They were professional law enforcement officers, trained to maintain emotional distance from their cases, to treat evidence objectively and follow procedures without becoming personally invested. But this case made distance impossible. The scale of it, the duration, the age of the victims, all of it pushed past the barriers they had constructed to protect themselves from the emotional weight of their work. They spent months walking the moors, searching for evidence, marking locations, documenting findings. They became intimately familiar with terrain that most people experienced only casually. They learned to read the landscape in ways that had nothing to do with appreciation of natural beauty. They looked at the rolling hills and saw sightlines, concealment opportunities, distances from roads. They studied the peat and understood its properties not as ecology, but as forensic context. The moors became for them a massive crime scene, and that knowledge transformed how they experienced the place in ways they could never fully articulate to people who had not shared the experience. Some of the investigators developed an aversion to open landscapes after the case concluded. They found themselves uncomfortable in spaces that reminded them of the moors, experiencing anxiety in environments they had previously enjoyed. Others had the opposite reaction, returning to the moors repeatedly during their off hours, as if trying to reclaim the landscape from the crimes, to see it again as something other than a repository of horror. Both responses were attempts to process trauma that could not be processed fully, to find some way of living with knowledge that could not be unknown. The departmental support systems available at the time were minimal. Officers were expected to be resilient, to handle difficult cases without requiring extensive emotional support. There was an institutional culture that viewed requests for help as weakness, that assumed professional training was sufficient preparation for any situation an officer might encounter. This was inadequate, as many of the investigators discovered through personal experience. They suffered symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, nightmares and intrusive thoughts, and difficulty maintaining normal relationships. But at the time, there was no framework for understanding these symptoms as job-related injuries rather than personal failings. Some sought help privately, finding therapists who worked with them outside the official channels. Others simply endured, hoping that time would dull the impact, that they could outlast the psychological damage through sheer persistence. The technical challenges of the investigation were immense, compounded by the condition of evidence that had been exposed to the elements for extended periods. Forensic science in that era was less advanced than it would become in later decades. DNA analysis was not yet available as an investigative tool. Identification relied on dental records, on personal effects, on physical characteristics that might survive environmental exposure. The peat's preservative properties, which had helped conceal the crimes, also complicated the forensic work. Bodies did not decompose in expected patterns. Tissues remained intact in ways that were both helpful and disturbing. The forensic pathologists who examined the evidence found themselves working with material that challenged their training and experience. They had to develop new approaches, new methodologies, because the standard procedures did not quite fit the circumstances they faced. This work was technically demanding, but it was also emotionally exhausting. The pathologists were examining children, working to extract information from remains that represented not just scientific specimens, but lives that had been violently interrupted. Maintaining professional detachment in such circumstances required a kind of psychological compartmentalization that took a toll over time. The legal proceedings that followed the investigation were complex and prolonged. Building cases that would stand up to courtroom scrutiny required meticulous documentation, ironclad chains of custody, expert testimony that could survive cross-examination. The prosecution team worked for months, preparing, anticipating every possible defense argument, reinforcing every element of their case. They knew the trials would be intensely public, that every detail would be examined not just by the defense but by the media and the watching nation. The pressure to secure convictions was enormous. These cases had to result in justice, not just for the victims and their families, but for the country as a whole, which needed to see that the system, having failed to prevent the crimes, could at least hold the perpetrators accountable. The trials themselves became national events covered extensively by every news outlet. Courtroom observers lined up hours before proceedings began, hoping for seats in the gallery. Journalists filed daily reports analyzing testimony, speculating about strategy, describing the demeanor of the accused and the reactions of families in attendance. The defense faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes undeniable, but the legal system requires defense, requires that even the most obviously guilty be represented, that the process be followed correctly, regardless of the outcome everyone expects. The defense attorneys understood they were not trying to prove innocence. They were trying to ensure that procedure was followed, that their clients received the fair trial, that the law guarantees every defendant. This was professionally necessary, but personally difficult. The attorneys knew they would be vilified for defending such clients, that their work would be seen as obstruction rather than as fulfillment of essential legal principles. Some received threats, angry letters from citizens who could not distinguish between defending someone in court and approving of their actions. The attorneys persevered because they believed in the system, because they understood that a system that denies fair trials to unpopular defendants will eventually deny fair trials to everyone. But the personal cost was real. They went home each night having spent their days immersed in horrifying details, having argued technical points about evidence that documented terrible things. They carried that weight without much public sympathy or support, performing a necessary function that most people preferred not to think about too carefully. The verdicts, when they finally came, surprised no one. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too clear, the perpetrators too obviously guilty. The convictions were received with grim satisfaction rather than celebration. Justice had been done in the narrow legal sense, but justice could not undo what had happened, could not restore what had been lost. The families of victims experienced complex reactions. Some felt relief that the legal process was concluded, that the perpetrators would be imprisoned, that there was at least this official recognition of the harm that had been done. Others felt nothing, or felt that the verdicts were inadequate, that no punishment could possibly be proportionate to the crimes. The sentences were severe as the law allowed, but they still felt insufficient to many observers. How do you measure appropriate punishment for crimes of this magnitude? How many years of imprisonment equal the life of one child, let alone multiple children? These questions have no satisfying answers. The legal system can impose consequences, but it cannot restore balance, cannot make things right in any meaningful sense. It can only mark the crimes as unacceptable, remove the perpetrators from society, and move forward with the understanding that justice is always incomplete in the face of irreversible harm. The aftermath extended far beyond the immediate participants in the case. Teachers and youth workers across the country found themselves re-evaluating their training, questioning whether they would recognize warning signs if they appeared. Parents became more cautious, more vigilant, imposing restrictions on their children's freedom that previous generations would have considered excessive. The culture of childhood changed in subtle but significant ways. Playing outside unsupervised, which had been normal and unremarkable, became something that required more thought, more planning, more anxiety. Walking to school alone, staying out until dinner time, riding bicycles through neighborhoods without adult oversight, these ordinary aspects of growing up became fraught with new concerns. Some of this increased caution was probably appropriate, a correction to assumptions that had been too casual about safety, but some of it represented an overcorrection, a level of vigilance that restricted children's development of independence and confidence. Finding the right balance proved difficult. Parents wanted their children to be safe, but they also wanted them to have the kinds of experiences that allow normal development. These goals were not always compatible, and different families made different choices about where to draw the line. The media's role in shaping public understanding of the case was significant and not always constructive. The initial reporting served an important function, bringing the crimes to public attention, demanding accountability, keeping pressure on authorities to complete the investigation thoroughly. But as the story developed, as the trials proceeded, some outlets began to sensationalize aspects of the case in ways that prioritized audience engagement over responsible journalism. Headlines became more lurid, descriptions more graphic, analysis more speculative. The perpetrators were examined in intense detail, their backgrounds dissected, their motivations debated, their psychology analyzed by experts and non-experts alike. This focus on the criminals, while understandable from a journalistic perspective, had the effect of making them famous, of centering them in a story where they should have been peripheral. The victims, whose lives had been cut short, became in some ways less visible than the people who had harmed them. Their names were repeated, their photographs published, but their actual personalities, their dreams and characteristics and the fullness of who they had been, these received less attention than the criminal profile of the perpetrators. Some families objected to this imbalance, arguing that the media was giving the perpetrators exactly what they wanted, which was attention and a kind of dark celebrity. But objections had little effect on coverage decisions. The perpetrators were the story, at least as far as many outlets were concerned, and the story was what sold newspapers and attracted viewers. The academic community also engaged with the case, producing studies and analyses from criminological, psychological, and sociological perspectives. Researchers examined the crimes as data, looking for patterns that might help identify similar situations in the future, prevent similar outcomes. This work was valuable in its way, contributing to the broader understanding of how certain types of crimes unfold, what warning signs might be visible in retrospect, what systemic failures enable prolonged criminal activity. But the academic analysis also had a distancing effect, transforming lived horror into abstract categories and theoretical frameworks. The human reality of what had happened became obscured by professional language, by charts and statistics and conceptual models. This was not intentional dehumanization, it was the natural result of applying analytical methods to traumatic events. But it created a gap between the academic understanding of the case and the emotional understanding held by people more directly affected. The studies were rigorous and well-intentioned, but they existed in a different register than the grief and anger and confusion that characterized the non-academic response. Religious communities struggled with their own questions about the case. How could such things happen in a world supposedly governed by divine providence? Where was protection when it was needed most? What did the crimes say about human nature, about the reality of evil, about the limits of faith as a protective force? Different traditions offered different answers, but none of the answers fully satisfied. Some religious leaders spoke about free will, about how God does not intervene to prevent human choices, even terrible ones. Others spoke about the fallen nature of the world, about living in a time between creation and redemption when suffering is an unavoidable reality. Still others questioned their own faith, wondering if belief could survive confrontation with such stark evidence of meaningless suffering. The pastoral care required in the aftermath was immense. Families needed support that went beyond platitudes, that could sit with their anger and doubt without trying to explain it away. Some clergy rose to this challenge, providing genuine comfort and accompaniment through grief. Others struggled, falling back on theological formulas that felt inadequate to the circumstances. The case tested religious faith in ways that revealed both its strengths and its limitations as a framework for understanding human experience. The long-term psychological impact on the broader community has been studied but never fully quantified. How do you measure the effect of learning that horror can hide in familiar places, that danger does not always announce itself, that the people around you might not be who they seem? These revelations change something fundamental about how people move through the world. The change is not always conscious or dramatic. It might be just a slight increase in baseline anxiety, a tendency to imagine worst-case scenarios, a reduced willingness to trust in the benevolence of strangers. These small shifts accumulate over time, shaping behavior in ways that become invisible because they are normalized. A generation grew up with the case as background knowledge, as part of the cultural landscape of their childhood. For them, the heightened vigilance was not a change, but simply how things were. They never experienced the more casual attitude toward child safety that had existed before. They never knew a time when parents did not worry constantly about abduction and harm. Their normal was shaped by events they had not lived through, by crimes that had been committed before they were born. This transmission of trauma across time, this way that historical events reshape the present, even for people without direct connection to them, is one of the less visible but more enduring effects of cases like this. The question of forgiveness arose periodically, usually in religious contexts, or in discussions led by people who had not been directly affected by the crimes. Could the perpetrators be forgiven? Should they be? Was forgiveness even a relevant concept in circumstances this extreme? The families of victims had wildly different views on this question. Some found their way to a kind of forgiveness, not because the perpetrators deserved it, but because carrying the burden of hatred and anger was destroying their own lives. They forgave to free themselves, not to absolve the guilty. Others rejected the concept entirely, arguing that some actions place people beyond the reach of forgiveness, that certain betrayals of human decency cannot and should not be excused or overlooked. Both positions were valid expressions of individual experience. There is no correct way to respond to the murder of your child. There is only the way each person finds to survive. The pressure to forgive, which sometimes came from well-meaning but misguided outsiders, was an additional burden that some families resented deeply. They had lost enough without also being expected to perform emotional grace for the comfort of observers who had lost nothing. The perpetrators themselves remained largely silent throughout the legal proceedings and in the years that followed. They offered no meaningful explanations, no expressions of remorse that anyone found credible. Their silence was strategic in some ways, minimizing legal vulnerability, but it was also a final exercise of control. By refusing to speak, by offering no insight into their motivations or thought processes, they maintained a kind of power, kept themselves enigmatic. This frustrated investigators and psychologists who wanted to understand, who believed that understanding might help prevent future crimes. But the perpetrators owed no explanations, and they knew it. Their silence was perhaps the last thing they could control, and they maintained it with the same discipline they had used to maintain their facade of normalcy during the years when they were actively committing crimes. Some people interpreted the silence as evidence of psychopathy, of an inability to feel remorse or empathy. Others thought it might reflect awareness that no explanation would be adequate, that anything they said would only cause additional harm. The truth remained inaccessible, locked behind the silence, and would likely remain that way. The cultural artifacts that emerged from the case were numerous and varied in quality and intention. Books were written, both true crime accounts that attempted to document the facts and fictional works that used the case as inspiration for narratives that changed details but preserved the essential horror. Documentary films were produced, some with cooperation from investigators and families, others without. Television dramas fictionalized the story, creating characters and situations based loosely on real events. This cultural production served multiple functions. It kept the story alive in public consciousness, ensured that the crimes would not be forgotten. It provided frameworks for understanding and discussing what had happened. It offered catharsis through narrative structure, through the imposition of beginning, middle, and end on events that in reality had no satisfying resolution. But the cultural exploitation of tragedy also raised ethical questions. Did the families consent to these representations? Were they compensated? Did the works honor the victims or simply use their suffering as raw material for entertainment? The answers varied case by case. Some cultural products were respectful and thoughtful, created with genuine desire to understand and memorialize. Others were exploitative, prioritizing shock value and commercial success over ethical considerations. The families had no control over most of this production. Once events enter the public domain, they become available for interpretation and reimagining by anyone who wants to engage with them. The physical landscape of the Yorkshire moors has been marked in subtle ways by what happened there. There are no official memorials, no plaques or monuments, but people who know the history can identify locations associated with the case. These places have taken on a kind of dark tourism appeal for a certain subset of visitors, people fascinated by true crime who seek out locations associated with famous cases. This tourism is generally discouraged, seen as disrespectful to the victims and their families, but it continues anyway. People take photographs, walk the same paths, stand in places where terrible things occurred, trying to understand something they cannot really grasp. The local population has mixed feelings about this attention. Some resent the intrusion, the way their home landscape has been claimed by a narrative they wish would fade. Others have become resigned to it, understanding that the association is permanent, that the moors will always carry this history alongside all their other history. The land itself remains neutral, indifferent to human projection and interpretation. The heather blooms and dies back regardless of what people remember or forget. The wind moves across the open ground without acknowledging the weight of the past. Nature continues its cycles, and in that continuation there is something almost comforting, a reminder that human drama, however terrible, is ultimately small against the scale of geological time. The institutional changes that followed the case were real but limited in scope. Police departments improved information sharing, creating databases and communication protocols that made it easier to identify patterns across jurisdictions. Training programs were updated to include more material on recognizing and responding to potential child predators. Social services agencies revised their procedures for tracking vulnerable children and investigating concerns. These were meaningful improvements, addressing specific failures that had contributed to the delayed detection of the crimes. But institutional change is always partial, always limited by resources and by the difficulty of anticipating every possible scenario. The next case, when it inevitably occurs, will likely reveal different failures, different gaps in the system. No amount of reform can create perfect protection because perfection is not achievable in complex human systems. The goal is not perfection but continuous improvement, ongoing attention to how things can fail and what might be done to reduce that risk. The case provided clear lessons about the importance of coordination and communication, about the dangers of treating similar cases as isolated incidents. Those lessons were learned and incorporated into practice, but they were specific lessons applicable to specific circumstances. They did not solve the broader problem of how society protects children from harm. They simply made the system somewhat better than it had been, which is all that reform ever really accomplishes. The conversation about the case continues decades later, though it has changed in character and intensity. For people who lived through the original events, who remember the shock of the revelations and the trials, the case remains vivid and immediate. For younger generations, it is historical, something they might learn about in school or encounter in documentaries, but not something that shaped their direct experience of the world. This generational difference in relationship to the events is natural and probably healthy. Society cannot maintain forever the intense focus and emotion that accompanies traumatic events. Life moves forward, attention shifts to more immediate concerns, the past becomes past. But something important can be lost in that transition, some understanding of how failures occur and why vigilance matters. The challenge is to preserve the lessons without preserving the trauma, to remember what needs to be remembered without being trapped by it. This is a difficult balance to strike, and different communities and institutions strike it differently. The Yorkshire moors remain a popular destination for walkers and nature enthusiasts, though visitor numbers have never fully recovered to their pre-case levels. Some people avoid the area because of the associations, because they cannot separate the natural beauty from the knowledge of what happened there. Others make a point of visiting, either because they refuse to let the crimes claim the landscape or because they are drawn by the complicated relationship between beauty and horror that the moors now represent. The experience of visiting is different now than it was before, even for people who know little about the specific history. There is a heaviness to the place that was not there before, or perhaps was always there but has become more noticeable, more available to perception. The isolation that once felt peaceful now feels more ambiguous. The vastness that once inspired awe now also inspires a kind of unease. These are subtle shifts in atmosphere rather than dramatic changes, but they affect how people experience the landscape. The moors have become a place of double meaning, beautiful and terrible, familiar and strange, open and concealing. They contain their history without advertising it, hold their secrets without revealing them to casual observation. The families of the victims have followed different paths, through the decades since the crimes. Some became advocates, working to change laws and policies, speaking publicly about their experiences, trying to create meaning from loss by preventing similar losses for others. This work gave them purpose, a way to channel grief into action, to feel that their children's deaths had not been entirely meaningless. Other families withdrew from public life, protecting their privacy, refusing to let their tragedy define them. They rebuilt their lives as best they could, finding ways to continue despite carrying wounds that never fully healed. Both approaches were valid, both were choices about how to survive the unsurvivable. There is no correct way to grieve, no right response to having your child murdered. There is only the response each person manages, the way each family finds to keep living when life has been fundamentally broken. The public sometimes judged these different responses, praising families who became activists while criticizing those who withdrew, as if privacy was somehow a failure of duty. But the families owed nothing to public expectation. They had already paid more than anyone should ever have to pay. How they chose to move forward was their business alone. The question that haunts this case, that haunts all cases like it, is whether it could have been prevented. Could someone have intervened earlier? Could different procedures or more attentive authorities have stopped the crimes before they accumulated? The honest answer is maybe. There were moments when different decisions might have led to earlier detection. There were opportunities that were missed, patterns that could have been noticed sooner. But it is also true that hindsight creates a false sense of inevitability, makes it seem as if the connections were obvious, when in fact they were only obvious after the full picture emerged. The people making decisions at the time did not have the full picture. They had fragments of information, conflicting demands on their attention, limited resources and imperfect systems. They made the choices that seemed reasonable given what they knew, and those choices proved inadequate. Learning from that inadequacy without descending into blame is difficult but necessary. The goal is not to punish people for failing to prevent crimes that no single person could have prevented alone. The goal is to improve systems so that future failures, while never eliminable, become less likely. The Yorkshire moors are still there, quiet and open and unchanged in their essential nature. Seasons continue their rotation. Weather moves across the landscape in patterns determined by physics rather than by human history. The peak continues its slow accumulation. The heather blooms and dies. The wind carries the scent of earth and grass across distances that make human concerns seem small and temporary. People still visit, still walk the established paths, still experience the sense of space and freedom that draws humans to open landscapes. Children still play at the edges of the moors, running through the heather, climbing on the rock outcroppings, experiencing the landscape as a place of adventure rather than tragedy. Life continues because life always continues, because the alternative is unthinkable. But underneath the continuation, underneath the appearance of normalcy, the knowledge remains. The moors witnessed what they witnessed. They held what they held. They played their unwilling role in a story that no one wished had been written. And that role, that history, has become part of what the landscape means, inseparable from its beauty, woven into its identity as thoroughly as the paths worn by generations of walkers or the boundaries marked by ancient stone walls. The Yorkshire moors are still there, exactly where they have always been, exactly what they have always been, and yet also fundamentally changed in meaning and association. And that is precisely why this story still matters, why it continues to demand attention and reflection decades after the crimes were committed and the perpetrators imprisoned. Because it is a story about the failure of assumptions, about the inadequacy of systems, about the ways horror can hide in familiar places and ordinary people can carry unimaginable darkness. It is a story about what we miss when we are not looking carefully enough, about what we lose when our institutions fail to protect the vulnerable, about the permanent mark that violence leaves on the landscapes that witness it. The Moors remember in their fashion, and in remembering, they remind us that safety is never guaranteed, that evil does not always announce itself, that the price of inattention can be measured in lives destroyed and families shattered. This is uncomfortable knowledge, the kind we would prefer not to carry, but carrying it is necessary because only by understanding how things went wrong can we hope to do better in the future.